It behooves us as Canadians to look to our close friend and neighbor, the United States of America, and ask what is on the horizon for our dear friend, the United States of America. So here today to talk about the United States is our friend, the president of the Brownstone Institute, Jeffrey Tucker.
So nice to be here. Thank you.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So welcome, Jeffrey. It's great to see you, and bravo on you and your entire team at the Brownstone Institute as you come up on your third anniversary. And if our audience is not familiar with the Brownstone Institute, I think that they're one of the leading lights for, dare I say, common sense, liberty, and all good thinking in terms of public policy in the United States of America. Or how would you describe your mission at the Brownstone Institute, Jeffrey?
Well, it's expanded.
Indeed.
I have to say, when I started Brownstone, I had a sense that there was an urgent crisis afoot in civilization. We'd never seen anything like lockdowns before. Society-wide vaccine mandates, restrictions on travel, closures of churches, businesses, freedom of association, freedom of speech. Everything was trashed essentially, and I had a sense that it was kicking off some disastrous stage, maybe a decade or more, and I was right.
You were right.
So we've tried to cover every aspect of this, from the attack on civil rights to censorship to the vaccines. And what is it that happened to us, and how did we get here? There's so many layers and meanings to all of this stuff. There's a political dimension. There's a medical, scientific dimension. There's a lot of strange things going on, and many, many ways to look at it. So that's what Brownstone has been devoted to doing. But it's all happened in a strange time, because in many ways, there was coinciding with the lockdowns and everything that followed, there was also a strange political purge that was alive, both in the U.S. and all Commonwealth countries too, to drive out of professions people that were, I would call them sort of dissidents against the prevailing orthodoxies, and that is intensifying, and it's all over academia, it's in media, in technology, and in politics, and that is getting more and more intense by the day. So we're combating that in addition to everything else. Sometimes I have to say, I'm just grateful that we still have the freedom to write and publish, because in a strange way, I can say with a lot of confidence that it was not supposed to be this way. We're supposed to have been shut down by now.
Wow.
Well, they haven't gotten their way, and so we're still alive and kicking and breathing for now.
Indeed. Well, we certainly admire the work that you and the entire team at the Brownstone Institute do, Jeffrey. And I think that, you're kind of a kindred institute in the sense that we're nonpartisan, but we're really trying to serve the larger nation in terms of bringing a perspective and a thoughtful insight on what's going on, and really engaging people to not take their freedom and liberties for granted. That's for sure.
Yeah. I was just watching an interview today with, there's this guy named Al Gore who once ran for the Democratic nomination. Okay. And it was really a startling interview, because he's regretting the existence of the internet, essentially, and he says it's really very.
Did he not invent the internet, Jeffrey?
No. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point.
Remember that one?
I forgot about that. Yes, he invented.
He did not. He did not, for the record.
No, he did not. But he says, but he's regretting everything about it, and saying that you can't have a democratic society so long as there's such a wide diversity of opinions on everything.
I
out
beg your
there.
pardon? What?
Yeah,
I,
that's what he said. As he said, democratic society requires a consensus on core truths that we used to be able to take for granted, that they were given to us by media, they were given to us by government, and
oh
everybody
my.
agreed on them. And within that framework, then we could debate and discuss. He said, but now, anybody can just find out anything. And he said, people are just getting on the internet and chasing going down rabbit holes and ending in echo chambers, he says. And
Isn't that interesting?
and it
Okay,
makes you realize just how severe the threat really is of censorship these days.
agreed. So we're going to go down the rabbit hole together,
Okay.
Jeffrey, holding hands as we look to the 2024 year. And I do want to get your help because, we have an audience worldwide, but particularly from Canada. And it's interesting. Like I would say that part of my family is American, and I would say that there's an element, and this is very humbling, even though we're close in proximity to the United States, we're kind of in an information bubble, I would say, as we get a lot of the mainstream media out of the United States. So I'm going to dare to, with your kind help, if you can give us a bit of a primer on the state of the United States as we go through, kind of catching up on things. Because this is going to be a pivotal year, I think, for the United States, and dare I say for Canada, by virtue of that, and certainly many parts of the world. So I need your help. So last time we spoke, we talked a lot about reflecting about COVID-19 and kind of rebuilding and renewing society. And that was a very insightful discussion. And I think one of the punchlines out of this is that, wow, we have a lot of the receipts and the data and then some, and we'd like more data. But we do know that Sweden did it right. Did they? Would you agree with that, Jeffrey?
Yeah, they went too far. I think they closed some schools for older, late high school and college. But for the most part, compared with most Commonwealth countries in the U.S., it seemed very open to almost everybody, and there were no masks and that sort of thing. And then they got a little carried away with vaccines, but so they went too far. I think by any standard, if the rest of the world didn't exist, you'd look at Sweden and go, "Wow, they went crazy over COVID." But actually, compared to the rest of the world, they were fantastic and they did a good job. Unfortunately, they're not really taking credit for it. There is a report that came out of Sweden just this week, I think, that is shy about bragging about how well they did.
The Swedish way.
Yeah. So it's fascinating because you would think that they would be crowing about their great successes, but the problem is it was such an international outlier that at this point there's a great deal of pressure from many sources for them to not take credit for the good job that they did.
But it's so ironic. So to be clear, as so many parts of the so-called Western world locked down and kind of went down that kind of conventional path of groupthink, Sweden didn't nearly to that extent. And the mortality rates, everything, economics prove that. I mean, that's pretty obvious.
They have the lowest excess deaths in all of Europe, actually, and that's just the COVID piece of this. But from an economic point of view, they really didn't experience any serious disruptions, and they don't have the suicide epidemics we have, the collapse in public health that we've seen in the U.S. and Commonwealth countries. It's really been a tremendous tragedy. The learning losses in the U.S. and maybe Canadians.
In Canada as well.
Our students have lost at least 2 years, but it seems to be every time they take a measurement, it seems to be getting more. So it was 2, then it was 3, then it was 4. So we've devastated a whole generation.
No, it's really, really sad. And I was just talking with a teacher the other day who was saying that they have so many 9-year-olds in their class that really behave like 5-year-olds. It's very sad because that socialization did not happen. So we've got a lot of work to do to catch up and look after the kids amongst so many others. So one of the things I did want to highlight is some of the extraordinary research that Brownstone yourself have been involved with, not the least of which has been working with associates like Naomi Wolf on really looking at the hard data the information, really peeling the onion to the nth degree on really the state of vaccines and are they safe and efficacious, and really getting down to that kind of data around the impacts on people. Is there a way that you could summarize this, Jeffrey, and just highlight that?
Yeah, there's usually three standards you use for any kind of medication. One is necessary, the other is safe, and the other is effective. The problem is that the COVID-19 vaccine fails on all three fronts, more so than any single medication probably ever, certainly vaccine, but even medication ever approved by the FDA.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Uh, necessary, safe, and effective. Okay, so the necessary point is that COVID was never a threat to the dominant working age population of healthy people, and virtually zero threat to kids. So there's that. It was never necessary. I mean, you could argue that it was necessary. A working vaccine would have been a valuable tool for elderly people who were infirm, who were actually in danger. But then you get to the second point about let's just say effective, and it wasn't effective. It never stopped infection and never stopped transmission. In fact, we have a tremendous amount of data that suggests that the vaccine actually made people more vulnerable to other kinds of infections, which is not untypical in the history of vaccines. It's called original antigenic sin, which is to say the vaccine, especially one for a deprecated strain, like alpha or delta or something like that, is going to rewire your immune system to make it only think about that one mutation, that one variant, and to make yourself vulnerable to all the other variants that are circulating simultaneously, and then open your immune system to other forms of maladies, whether it's rashes or tinnitus or something. So there's that, and then you have these mystery myocarditis outbreaks that are all over the place that are leading to grave injury and death, and we've never seen anything like this in the vaccine world. I mean, it puts to shame every other vaccine that we've ever had. When I was a kid, they tried to get us all to take the vaccine. This was sometime in the 1970s. Tried to get everybody to take a vaccine for the swine flu, and it turned out that there were just a handful of reports of injuries and fatalities from this, and they called it off instantly. And I remember that my vaccine was scheduled in the public school, and I was terrified of it. And then they just said, "Oh, we're not going to take it," and I was thrilled, right? So they're not doing it this time because the standards have dramatically changed. The other problem is, and we can get into this or not, but the COVID-19 vaccine really exists under different kinds of level of regulatory approval from any vaccine in history. It's the so-called emergency use authorization, but even aside from that, it was authorized as a military countermeasure.
So it was kind of a workaround to the typical process that we'd envision. It was a military regulatory framework that was used, right?
So it was neither necessary nor safe nor effective, and this is a major problem, and it's a huge scandal. In fact, there's pretty much a taboo around this topic. I mean, for the very first time in our whole political season in the U.S., last night was the first night in all four GOP debates that the subject of the vaccines came up at all. And even then, you could almost feel it in the room, this sort of feel of like, oh no, what's going to happen now?
Interesting.
And I'm so happy to say that at least two of the candidates said that they were going to eliminate the indemnification for liability that these vaccines have.
Okay, I missed that one. So you're saying that during the Republican debate, the whole issue that the vaccines were not maybe safe and effective, and that it begs the issue that their so-called sweetheart agreement with the manufacturers that would indemnify them, at least save them from any liability for some, was it 75 years, if memory serves me correctly, Jeffrey?
Something like that. It's ever. There's a slight process that you can appeal to the government for if you believe that something went wrong. But there have been 12,000 people who have tried to do this, and that you can't have legal representation. There's no appeal. There's no transparency to it. Only 8 people have been granted any kind of compensation out of potentially hundreds of thousands who are injured from this. And this is all traces to a law that was passed in 1986 that was renewed under the emergency use authorization and reinforced in a March 13th, 2020 edict. And so there's no recourse for the injured. And it was very heartbreaking that this would ever happen in a free society. So this came up by the one of the moderators, whose name is Megyn Kelly, and she herself was vaccine injured. And so she has a personal stake in this and actually asked them about it. And both DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy said that that indemnification should be eliminated immediatit Now, it's a long word and it sounds complicated, but the point is that it's very likely these companies would not be in business if it weren't for the indemnification. Their stocks would fall to zero, and they'd probably be instantly. Most certainly, they'd be instantly bankrupt.
Indeed. So this is a big story. Not only in the United States, but it'll be interesting to see how those floodgates open inevitably. As they say, the truth will set us free, and so that will be fascinating. And what's also interesting is this is turning into frankly, a month of bombshells. We all heard about Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, or formerly Twitter, now X, was essentially a crime scene. And we know that there was the release of the Twitter files, and he assigned these to some pretty crack journalists, including Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberg, among others. And what was fascinating is that we learned a lot about the receipts around the so-called censorship industry, the emphasis that governments were directing social media companies to ironically squelch the kind of information that we're talking about regarding COVID-19, instead of enabling healthy, open debate to seek truth and in service of people. They were doing the opposite. I mean, it's just stunning. And now we've got almost like a second revelation of bombshells related to, wow, it wasn't just kind of half measures of censorship. This is a full-fledged complex. You've referred to it several times, Jeffrey, as the kind of the censorship industrial complex. Can you help us understand what's going on there? I think a lot of Canadians are still, pardon the pun, but very much in the dark on this entire topic. It's really hard to believe. A judge even described it as 1984. Yeah.
We have a First Amendment in this country that says Congress can make no law abridging the freedom of speech, which by Congress means government. So the government cannot actually tell you what you can and cannot say, and cannot tell companies what they can and cannot say. So what happened was they started developing, a lot of these agencies started developing new agencies, and those new agencies were tagging third-party nonprofit organizations, universities, foundations, other research groups, volunteer groups that were related, contracting out with the FBI, with the Cybersecurity Information Security Agency, and many, many other agencies. And we've seen maps of these things, and they're the most complicated maps you've ever seen. So,
like, we're talking real organization charts of 67 alphabet bureaucratic organizations, right?
And what this allowed was what they called switchboarding. So you would just kind of move between the organizations and send out threatening emails, have meetings, regularly scheduled meetings, embedded employees. Twitter had many, many FBI agents embedded within its ranks. The FBI even paid Twitter to employ them, so actually paid the salaries of these people. So they give Twitter a subsidy, and then Twitter would in turn flip that over to the employees. And what it amounted to was a kind of a nationalization of social media that began in earnest, really, sometime in the early of 2020, sometime in, say, January, February. And it covers everything. So it's Google, which means YouTube, and it's Microsoft, which means LinkedIn. And then it's Meta, which means Facebook and Instagram. And then also included in that is other things like Pinterest and lesser known things like your neighbor. I mean, there's all these social
Yeah.
media things that they had it covered entirely. And anybody who was dissenting against this and allowing free open debate about lockdowns, about vaccine mandates, about masks or
Hmm.
anything, got put on a list. And one of them is a social media company called Parler, really got going
Yes. Right.
in 2020, and the FBI leaned on Amazon to pull the plug on the company. So they were renting server space from Amazon, and the next thing you know, just one day, the next they were out of business. So they really were trying to consolidate and monopolize the information. So, if you wondered over the last 4 years if there's something strange going on with the
Hmm.
media and what you see, the things you search for, how come you can't seem to
Yeah.
find
Exactly.
things that are different from what the mainstream believes?
Hmm.
This is the reason. It was all a kind of a construct. It was
Hmm.
a central plan to control the public
The
mind,
whole
to
thing.
get everybody on board with
Yeah.
this
The whole
lie.
thing. And so, yeah, it's a stunning revelation. And I admit, like years ago, I mean, this is goes back through history. Those in power want to obviously control information of the masses. But this is a stunning revelation, and the facts are there. It's not like some kind of, quote, conspiracy theory. I mean, ironically, the ones who are always pitching and trying to dismiss people who are researching this as conspiracy theorists are obviously the ones who are up to the conspiracy. And so this is kind of a game changer, is it not, Jeffrey? As
It
we,
is. And we've got many lawsuits that are brewing about these things, and they're making headway at various levels, uh, and in the lower levels and the appeals levels and this kind of thing. But the strange thing about it is that despite these lawsuits ongoing, they're not really making a difference in slowing down how much censorship is going on even right now. So we don't really entirely have transparency. So we don't actually know. But I can tell you, I had an interview taken down from YouTube the other day. It was an innocuous interview, lasted an hour and a half, and it wasn't even as dicey as what you and I are saying right now. And it was removed from YouTube within 24 hours. And I think this is about the 12th interview I've had removed. So,
oh my,
yeah.
okay.
And this is YouTube, which is owned by Google. Google's the most important technology company in the world. Is Alphabet, but the CIA is definitely embedded there. And I'm sorry if I feel even awkward saying things like this, even though I know them to be for a fact true. But if somebody had said to me 5 years ago, "Oh, Google's
Yeah,
controlled by the CIA," I would have said, "Well, you're a crazy person. That's a private company. That can't
right.
be true." But what we've seen is this blend of government and corporate power into one single kind of hegemon that is really trying to control what you
Wow.
think and believe.
Well, it is, yeah, it's unnerving that I guess what you're alluding to there, Jeffrey, is a kind of a sense of self-censorship. Is that right?
Yeah. It's getting worse. If you want to be on YouTube, you know what you can, or you think you know what you can and cannot say. It's not always consistently enforced, but this is the way authoritarianism is, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's like they don't give you clear rules. So as a result, you're always dancing around. You're super
Wow.
careful. A couple of nights ago, I watched this movie. It came out in the early 2000s called The Lives of Others. It's a movie about East Germany, and I guess it won Best Foreign Language Picture, something like that. And I watched it, and I thought, wow, we really are headed this direction. It's quite alarming.
Yeah.
Now, I think one way to think about this is that the U.S. right now has kind of two federal governments that are working simultaneously with each other, or sometimes at cross purposes, but they're operating at the same time. It's one is the legacy government, the one that maybe took the Constitution seriously, obeyed
Yeah.
the limits, um, cranked out the data, just kind of did their level best to, be America. And then you have a new round of agencies that were created after Trump's election in 2016 with his knowledge or without his knowledge. It's not clear, but they really flew into major action in March 2020, and this is the Cybersecurity Information Security Agency, one division within the FBI. There's also the NIH under
Yeah.
Fauci, the CDC, and so on. One division of the National Security Council, and so. And this is a kind of what I've called the Great Reset government.
Yeah,
And
right.
it's kind of a separate thing. So it's we don't really have a word for it. In the old days, you would say this feels like a coup d'état, and it kind of is, except that the people that came into power under the coup with their censorship and their canceling and their mandates and their surveillance and all these things are very enormously powerful, but they exist alongside the legacy government that
Right.
actually did obey the rule of law and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
these two kind of federal governments are operating simultaneously with each other right now. Again, the legacy government versus the Great Reset government.
Yeah.
And
so
my
to be
own-
clear, like for a Canadian audience, I think that's an important revelation, is the
Yeah.
sense that there are vigorous, as if anyone hasn't noticed, a vigorous debate about what kind of society the United States is
Yeah.
going to be. And
Yeah.
within the state, you have a kind of I'm not going to say a civil war, but a war of sorts going between these institutions.
Yeah.
And that's part of the microcosm of that is, of course, the famous FBI, in the sense that they've always had enormous power. But in this context, it's very clear that the leadership of the FBI is thoroughly rotten to the core.
Yeah.
And it's not clear whether the culture or the larger organization can be saved. Now, there are certainly many cases of whistleblowers that have come forward that have revealed this, the receipts. It's not like it's even a debate. The facts are there. The information is stunning. And what I find fascinating is it's the level of other agencies that should be checking that power and creating accountability. It's where a lot of this malfeasance is not being held to any account. There's
that's
no
right.
one going to jail. It's really quite stunning, isn't it, with the Department of
Yeah.
Justice and so forth, right?
But this also explains how it is that you could have all of these lawsuits taking place at all levels of society that are quasi-successful, except right at the very last minute, at the appeals level, at some point, there's a panel of judges that just throws the whole thing out.
Exactly.
And this is why they're not really worried about things like this major censorship
Yeah.
case. They're just going about their business, ignoring it, even though a federal court in the Fifth Circuit said, "Oh, you can't do this. Here's our injunction." The injunction was upheld, and now the injunction's even being scheduled to be heard by the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
But there's a conviction on the part of this Great Reset government that they don't have to obey this law.
Right.
So they just ignore it. And remarkably, this actually happened yesterday. There was a hearing on Capitol Hill where the Assistant Attorney General for the Biden's Department of Justice was asked specifically about these cases, and she said she had never heard of them before.
Yeah. No, they walk around, of course she's heard of them, but walk around with impunity in plain sight now, which is really quite stunning. It is really quite disconcerting. So what about the First Amendment case, though? The little noticed lawsuit, Missouri versus Biden, as in Joe Biden?
It's gotten almost no public attention. I mean, after the injunction was upheld by the appeals court, there was a front page article in the New York Times, just one story. That was it. It was woefully inaccurate. It was putting the lawsuit down. It was saying it just doesn't mean anything and that sort of thing. But it was one story. Apart from that, it's been very difficult to get any media attention at all. And this becomes very serious because if you don't really have an operative First Amendment in this country, you've got a real chance. Freedom's been given a big blow under those conditions.
Indeed.
It's very
You
dangerous.
really are done if you don't have freedom of speech.
That's right.
And you have and I will use the phrase deliberately, the deep state sitting there censoring everywhere you turn. You do not have freedom of speech, and you don't have a functioning society in terms of the free information of the seeking for truth. I mean, it's really quite disturbing. So that is going to the Supreme Court. And the initial decision, I think, by the judge, I would encourage people to read it if they can, is really quite encouraging. I really admired that judge's decision. He described what's going on in the U.S. government as 1984 a la George Orwell.
Yeah.
And I think it was a pretty stunning decision that gives hope, does it not, Jeffrey?
It does. Now, there are many, so just so we understand the fullness of this, because the evidence was so overwhelming, the judge, before having heard the case, passed what's called an injunction to stop the federal government from doing this. He says, we're pretty sure the way it's going to be decided.
Yeah.
So here's our emergency preliminary injunction to stop the government from doing that. Was appealed. In the appeal, the injunction was gravely narrowed. There was an appeal of that appeal, and then it was broadened slightly again, not enough. But and then the Biden administration appealed that appeal of the injunction, and that's headed to the Supreme Court. That decision will come out sometime maybe February or March.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, this is just the injunction, okay? So the case itself has yet to be heard. And that will not be going to court until probably 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And then when it goes to court, it will be at the lowest level. Then there will be an appeals process. And then that itself may go to the Supreme Court. So we could be looking at 5 years before we get a conclusion to this thing. Meanwhile, you've got all these government agencies still working very closely with all the social media and training all these employees in these companies to kind of comply.
Yeah.
So, I'm optimistic in a sense, but at the same time, we shouldn't be having to go through all this stuff.
Yeah,
This is
no,
crazy.
it's outrageous. And I would say that, I mean, the whole revelation that you've got 60 alphabet agencies working hard in concert as a team to censor everything that moves to political ends is incredibly disturbing. It is 1984 there, and it would make the CPP, the Chinese Communist Party, blush when it comes to what they're trying to pull off.
And this is what they want to do. And what's strange about it is that, all these lawsuits are designed to kind of say, hey, look, you can't do this. And then the appeal from the Biden administration is always like somewhere between, yes, we can, and we're not doing that. So it's and both can't be true, right?
Right.
It's like, you can't say we're not doing that at the same time saying, but if we wanted to, we would, and we could, So it's both. And there's no question that the ambition is a full control of the public mind through the full control of the internet. They want to get rid of the internet as we know it.
Indeed. So the other side to significant legal action is kind of on the consumer product side. We've got the bombshell of the Texas lawsuit being tabled by the great AG, Ken Paxton. And in the release it says, Pfizer engaged in false, deceptive, and misleading acts and practices by making unsupported claims regarding the company's COVID-19 vaccines and violations of Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act. Wow, go figure. So I think that's a brilliant lawsuit, in my humble opinion, that really gets at the heart of the matter. This is a product that claimed 95% effectiveness, if memory serves me correctly. And it comes out more like maybe 3 or 4%. Who knows? But it's a fraction.
If at all.
A fraction.
If at all. Maybe
if
it's
at all.
closer to zero.
Yeah, or
But,
even maybe negative. Who knows?
And you have to consider, there's a number of things about this, just so we understand. It's true that these companies are indemnified from any kind of liability for the damages, but they're not free under state law to just make whatever claims they want. I mean, it still is a country of laws. So if they're claiming something very effective, and under interstate commerce, a state says you're in violation of our consumer laws, you can't actually engage in deceptive trade practices. They actually are very vulnerable. And I think this threat by the Attorney General Paxton is a particularly viable one. And I say this because he's been trying to drop this lawsuit for a long time. I'm going to say I may be
That's right.
misestimating, but I think it was in the spring of 2023. He was going to drop this lawsuit. And a week before he did, he was impeached
And
just
it
out of
came,
nowhere.
and it was really quite an extraordinary process that
Yeah.
had
I
not a
mean,
shred of evidence,
nope.
not a shred of
And
evidence.
he showed up one morning to his office, and an elected position, the attorney general. Shot out of his office. All of his papers collected. Couldn't get to his computer. Couldn't.
Horrible.
Everything was shut down. His phone was shut down. Everything was. It was impeached by the legislature, and then about 2 months went by where he wasn't able to do any work. So the voters elected him to his office. He wasn't allowed to do it, and they were unable to come up with anything substantial. That they just alleged this, alleged that. It was all just these weird, complicated things you couldn't even follow. Then it turned out it all fell apart. And once the lawmakers looked at it carefully, they said, "Wait, this is entirely bogus. You can't do this."
Yeah.
And he was reinstated. And now we've got the lawsuit against Pfizer.
Yeah. No,
suddenly
it's
alive again.
remarkable. Yeah. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of, frankly, dirty pool going on here.
yeah,
And
there definitely
you
is.
know, it's kind of like they're playing for all the marbles. When you think of freedom of speech, the amount of money involved is stunning.
Yeah,
It's hard to comprehend. So, in this context, though, freedom of speech and information, Jeffrey, do matter in a free and democratic society in order for you to be able to have healthy debate and discussion and actually function. And that's, would you say is it too dramatic to say that's in jeopardy in the United States?
I think it's been in jeopardy for, more than we know, for longer than we know. Um, I often think about this. How existential is this for us? And I think part of the problem is that when I was growing up, when I was younger, we really did have pretty much full control, fully government controlled media. So there were three television stations, and there was no other way to get information. There was 30 minutes of news a night, and you could take your pick between the three stations. They all said the same thing.
Was that
And
ABC, CBS, and NBC? And
yeah,
is
that's
that
right.
it?
And then it gradually unraveled over time. So suddenly we had PBS channels, then CNN, and then more cable news shows, and then we had talk radio come along, AM talk radio, and then just gradually over the decades,
And then the internet.
and then yeah, that was during the 80s, and then in 1995 we got the web browser invented, and suddenly, and the internet went out not just with the universities; they were in every home, and by 10 years later, we're talking about 2005 and afterwards. We really did have a kind of a freedom. It was uncontrolled information flows, which I believe is very good for democracy. And that's when we started finding out more and more things about what the government was up to, and the political systems got a little bit disruptive. And really, the turning point was 2016, once Donald Trump was elected. There's a widespread sense among a certain class, which I just call the ruling class in this country, highly educated, Ivy educated, well-to-do, privileged people, civil servants, people that easily make their way between the revolving doors of corporate boardrooms and government appointments. These people who imagine themselves to be the owners of the country.
The good and the great, Jeffrey.
Yes, right. And when Trump was declared the winner in 2016, they said, okay, this is not the way this is supposed to work. Guys like this are not supposed to be president.
How dare him?
And he's up to he's up to no good, and he's going to do some terrible things. And that's when really my read on the situation is that's when they really got to planning, and they tried to go after him on grounds that he was secretly elected by Russia. That turned into just an absurd thing that lasted nearly 2 years. And then they went after him again, impeached him a second time over some phone call to Ukraine, which I never really understood. And then they finally decided to pull out the biggest card of all, which is the infectious disease thing. And that's when it all came together. And then they finally got him. once they convinced him to green light lockdowns. And once he had okayed the lockdowns in March
Yeah.
2020, he very naively thought he could turn off the economy and turn it back on again. Everything would be great. Well, once he turned it off, the rats took over the ship. I don't know what the analogy here would be, but
Yeah.
he was unable to regain his power of the presidency and reduced to, using Twitter and otherwise just giving speeches and
It sounds like a coup, doesn't it, Jeffrey?
Yeah, it really does. It was very much like that. I'm not sure he saw it that way, but he certainly, after March, he didn't really ever act as if he was the president of the country again, because I think he knew he sort of wasn't. And then as part of that March 2020 coup d'etat, that was March 13th, was really the day. They also liberalized all the voting rules in this country.
Indeed,
so
yeah.
that enabled them to make sure
The election was done.
that he could not become president. And I remember in those months leading up to the election, I was traveling around here and there. And every time I landed in a different state, I got Facebook's Zuckerberg hitting my phone, giving me another ballot. So I probably could have voted in 5 states.
Oh, no kidding. So you actually got multiple ballots too?
Oh, yeah. No,
Wow.
I mean, yeah, invitations. Oh, get your ballot right here. Get this ballot here. Oh, you're from Georgia, get a ballot. Oh, you're from Texas, get a ballot. And yeah, you're from Connecticut, get a ballot.
Isn't
so
that
yeah,
something?
I could have just had it sent immediately to the hotel.
Yeah.
And had them forwarded to me. I could have voted in 5 states.
And see, in Canada, I think we've got a generally solid electoral system, although there's some very valid concerns about Chinese interference in 24 specific federal ridings, among other things. So no electoral system is perfect, but we do count our ballots in one day, and we do announce the results as a rule. Whereas in the United States, it's almost like you're entering now a la post-COVID rules, an utter, a bizarre purgatory of election season where elections are going on for a month, and you've got, mail-in ballots, and you've got third-party organizations literally harvesting, quote, ballots from other parties. It's just, to me, it's a head-scratcher that anyone would allow this to happen in any democracy. It's like a farce, is it not?
Yeah, it is. And there's, as you know, there's 2 main parties in the U.S., and they're fighting with each other over these rules right now. So I think that the Republicans, as incompetent as they are, and they definitely are getting a little more scrupulous about trying to police the system a little bit.
Yeah.
So this is what has, right now, the major media very concerned that Trump could actually win.
Right, indeed. And he's doing stunningly well in the polls, and it seems like the more they attack him and try to lock him up for, is it 900 years now with the 4 indictments, that he's doing better. So part of this is truly kind of a wake-up call for all of us to understand kind of what's going on in the United States.
Yeah.
And we certainly wish you and the nation all the best as you come to grips with this. But I did want to turn to 2024, because what we've really done is we've summarized kind of the, kind of where we're at now in the United States, given this brutal reality of a censorship industrial kind of complex that is very much there in plain sight, that almost seems to be operating on its own interests. And it's not, I don't see it through partisan lens, but I do want to get to that in a moment. So let's turn to the 2024 election, Jeffrey, if we could. Because oftentimes it almost senses that the bigger picture at first, as we look to 2024, is that we have an incredible nation that has made a extraordinary difference from around the world, and an empire of sorts that is on the decline. As we look at the stunning levels of deficits, debt is incredible. Like there's even talk about the de-dollarization in the world. Like just as the British pound was the reserve currency, it's almost like someday it looks like conceivable that the United States will lose that privilege that it is so unique. So, and that the elites, and this is kind of similar to Canada, the narrative that I hear so often, is the elites have become extraordinarily not just incompetent, but insular, and dare I say, even malevolent in its disdain for their fellow citizens and even for working people. Like, is that a narrative that you would say is very much alive in the United States discourse now? That it's
Yeah,
one
very,
of
very true. There's a book I just finished called The Virtue Hoarders, and it came out in 2021. And it was by a person who's very much to the left. And they said, look, the last time, it might have been 50 or 100 years ago since the left actually cared about the working class. Now, the progressives, who are really constitute the ruling class, are overwhelmingly extremely privileged from several generations of wealth. Ivy graduates, mostly with legacy admissions, shunted into these high salary jobs at major corporations revolving in and out of the government, and they have no interest in or concern for the working classes at all, much less the poor, who are invisible to them. In fact, we saw this during the pandemic response. They wanted to hide in their homes and stream movies in their pajamas and get paid six figures.
Yeah.
And have the working class to just bring them food, drive the trucks.
The truckers.
Fix the plumbing and that sort of thing. It's just this extreme class myopia on the part of our rulers today. These are unelected people. They just have inherited their position, windowed their way in, but they are a rock solid class of rulers that has disdain for the rest of the country. Yeah, but they call us deplorables. They hate our they can't stand Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk is facing like 8 different federal investigations just since he took over Twitter. You know, for every ground. I mean, one of the grounds is that his company, rocket company, whatever it's called, did not, maybe it was Tesla even, did not hire enough refugees.
Oh, SpaceX.
Well,
yeah.
SpaceX was not hiring enough refugees.
Utterly bizarre, yeah. So they're going after him. The Securities Exchange Commission is going after SpaceX because he supposedly has not hired sufficient number of refugees.
Yeah. And now you've got this full-scale advertising boycott on the part of
Disney and all the rest. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's extremely intense right now, and this interview is taking place in the midst of this kind of this Cold War that is going to consume us for a very long time, certainly through the rest of the decade, and the panic that's alive among this group right now about Trump's popularity. And let me be clear, I'm not a big fan of Trump. In fact, I wrote a whole book very critical of him, back in 2016. So I'm not like,
but you're not a partisan.
But I do think that we should live in a democracy so that if a plurality of voters favor this guy as president over the options and his policies, then that's the system under which we live.
But this is the tactic that's being used. It's not about Donald Trump. He is a figure, a symbol for something that's much more significant in terms of tidal waves of activity going on between these kind of two Americas, if I would say, kind of this ruling racket, if that's too strong a word, that thrives off a big state and control versus, frankly, a kind of an America which really thrives on more civil liberty and small businesses to things that you would think America is. But is it
faith and freedom and patriotism and that sort of thing versus the 1%. The 1% that is ruling us doesn't care anything about the Constitution. They actually have disdain for the Founding Fathers. They have no interest in American history except to the extent that they want to criticize it. For being inherently racist and so on.
So how the heck did the 1%, the Al Gore's the epitome of this. I mean, he was a senator. His dad was a senator out of Tennessee, and you've got some guy driving around in a private jet, thriving on green climate change credits and all kinds of things. Like, made all these predictions about things. Nothing has happened true, makes claims about inventing the internet. So not to be too hard on Al Gore, but how did they lose their way so much? You have a theory on that, Jeffrey?
This book is very interesting. It's called The Virtue Hoarders, and she just finds that they gradually, generation after generation, inherited more and more of these kind of privileges and lived in ever more bubble sort of situations, and during which time the state became ever more powerful. Then, when the opportunity came for the Great Reset, they've embedded themselves very much in digital technology and all the new technologies, and green energies and social media and surveillance and data sharing and all these things that are associated with Great Reset style technologies. And they want a greater share for themselves and want permanent power, and to get rid of the old world of so-called fossil fuels, and physical meetings, and all these things that are associated with sort of traditional life. They really just want to wipe them out. Constitutions and patriotism, all these old values, religion, they want it all gone. And of all people, it was Anthony Fauci who, in August of 2020, actually wrote an article for the journal called Cell.
Oh, yeah, I heard about that.
He said this, which he basically said this, you shouldn't be allowed to own pets. You shouldn't be going to family reunions. We all need socially distance now and forever. Dousing ourselves with hand sanitizer and living off Zoom. That's really their vision of the future. And, this is totally disregarding for people's actual values, and certainly for the working class values. And meanwhile, they're driving the prosperity into the ground. I mean, the U.S. growth rates right now are pathetic when they're not manipulated. Mostly they are manipulated.
Right.
I doubt we've ever really gotten out of the recession that came about in 2020. So, and with this is becoming a kind of population agenda. So the child care is hard, if not impossible, to come by in the U.S. And now you're starting to see the State Department wage a war against what's called the au pairs, which are people that come into your house to take care of your kids. And the State Department's imposing a rule that would make them 3 and 4 times more expensive than they are currently, making it impossible for people to even afford somebody to look after the kids, which is going to drive all the women out of the workplace and reduce family size even further. So all of this is going on right now. You add all this together, and it really does look like a major crisis for civilization. It really is starting to be a kind of an us-them situation.
Gosh.
And I hate to say that, because I never wanted to live in a world like this. I didn't want to be the one sounding the alarm on these things, but it's undeniable now. Really, everything is at stake.
So it really is you're really challenging us to think there, Jeffrey, about not only the state of the United States, but frankly of every Western world, including Canada.
Yeah.
So I do want to look at 2024 with your kind help, because there's a kind of a constellation of political parties, a landscape, if you will. And it's a little bit confusing, I think, to a lot of Canadians, and one of which is we know we have the Democratic Party, which traditionally has been kind of the working class party. They were, of course, years ago the traditional party of slavery. But they transformed themselves. They worked hard to, quote, be the more kind of left of center party. I mean, it's a bit complicated. But today, they're really not so much about the working Americans. They've kind of taken on a different kind of ideological mantle of representing. They're kind of woke. There's different wings of the Democratic Party, but they're really about endless spending and maybe even endless wars these days. But is that a fair characterization of the Democrats?
It is. I mean, nobody can even figure out why the U.S. is supporting Ukraine in this conflict.
It's a big mystery. Yeah.
Except, and to the extent that it can be explained by some sort of Biden family dealings in Ukraine, and maybe some bioweapons factories. I don't really know.
Right.
But the U.S. can't afford these wars.
Yeah.
It's just absurd. The other thing to remember here is that this is not just a U.S. problem; it's a global problem. So I would encourage everybody to read Klaus Schwab's book called The Great Reset. It's kind of the Communist Manifesto of
Klaus Schwab.
The Klaus Schwab, and it's the Communist Manifesto of the Great Reset, and it really is a manifesto for what it is that what they hope to achieve, and not just in the U.S. But all over the world. So it's quite dramatic.
Yeah, it's an eye opener. It's kind of shocking to read it, actually. So I agree.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the U.S. political system, of course, the U.S. does not have a parliamentary system. So if you could have 47% of the country, or 49% of the country representing one particular perspective, rallying around one particular candidate, they're still going to lose everything because it's a winner-take-all system. Parliamentary systems, even the 2% get some representation in the legislative bodies. Not true in the U.S. What that means is that we would typically default to two parties.
Right.
That's just a matter of the logic of the situation. Because when you go to the voting booth, you would tend to vote against the person you hate the most. And for the person who's most likely to beat the person you hate the most, even if you don't like them. So that's the way two-party systems. That's the way first past the post, winner-take-all democracies work.
Well. Good point.
This creates a real problem for somebody like Robert Kennedy, who's enormously popular in the U.S. I've just spent some part of yesterday and today reading his new book called The Wuhan Cover-Up, which I think might be the best book on all this stuff.
Oh, no kidding.
It's a work of genius, 1,000 pages. It is a masterpiece. He's enormously popular, but he has to run on a third-party ticket because he was excluded from the Democratic nomination process.
Yeah. Ironically, and he would be kind of considered part of the royalty of the Democratic Party.
Ironically, yeah.
Right.
So he's looking at an independent run. Now, the main job of an independent third-party run in this country turns out to be a kind of a spoiler, ruining the election for either Biden or Trump. Nobody can say for sure which one is more powerful, but what you see now happening is more people looking at third-party runs as a way of blunting the impact of RFK. So it's getting extremely complicated. I can see why you're asking these questions. It is complicated. So we could have 3 or 4 viable candidates running for third party, none of whom stand any chance of winning, but they're competing for who can spoil the election for the other guy.
Wow.
And how that turns out in terms of the polls, you tell me. And you see these things saying, they ask voters questions like, well, who do you favor, Trump, Biden, or RFK? And RFK comes out on top. But those kinds of polls are not meaningful in terms of what they're going to mean operationally in terms of the election, because you might love RFK. Let me see how this will work. You might love RFK, but really, really despise Trump, and you might, or despise Biden. You might figure the only way to beat Biden is to vote for Trump. So you might not even like Trump, and you love RFK, but you're still going to vote for Trump because you think he's the biggest hammer you can use against the person you hate the most, which is Biden. The polls are rarely, if ever, constructed this way, so we don't actually know how people would actually vote once they get into the voting booth.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
But to be clear, we've got the Democrats, and of course Joe Biden's ahead of that, and then we've got these dynamic of independents that you've summarized so well, including Bobby Kennedy Jr. to boot. And then you have the Republicans. And the Republicans are confusing because it seems like there was a reverse takeover of sorts over the last several years by Donald Trump, the so-called Make America Great movement, which was about saying, well, all this governance that's going on is really kind of outsourcing manufacturing jobs to Timbuktu, including China. And, you're not really governing this 1% that you so adeptly described. You're not really governing for the American people. You're driving us into the ground. You're taxing us to death. And we don't want these endless wars that our kids fight in and die in. And meanwhile, we want to build the United States. And I think so they've taken over really the Republican Party. So that you have a lot of Republicans that would be known as rhinos, right? They're they claim they're Republicans, but they're really more like Democrats. Is that how am I understanding
There's
that right?
There's a huge split within the Republican Party between I would say what you're calling the MAGA people, which is the Trump people. Then you've got the rhinos, who are the Republicans in name only, who can't stand Trump. Then you've got a third faction, which is represented by somebody like DeSantis or Ramaswamy, who don't like Trump because they think he's too accommodating, right?
Sorry,
So
too accommodating.
yeah,
Okay.
to deep state interests. I mean, is Trump the green lighted the lockdowns
Interesting.
and has a great deal of affection. He will not criticize the vaccines and so on. So there's people that are like Trump. In these terms, might be a more moderate character relative to somebody like DeSantis or Ramaswamy.
Isn't that fascinating?
Like that.
So
Yeah.
the point is that you've got to kind of understand these basics of who these parties are, and then there's another big factor, which is the quote administrative state, the so-called deep state, which seems to be like that fourth arm of government. It's almost scary, that is kind of running the show beneath everything, as we've kind of alluded to with the so-called industrial censorship complex. Like this is beyond, that almost seems to be impervious to elections. They're almost into selections, not elections. Is that fair,
And
Jeffrey?
Yeah, and that's what Trump wants to make a dent in their power. This is an institution that's nowhere in the Constitution. You can't find it. There's nothing about independent agencies in the U.S. Constitution at all. So it's just grown gradually over the last 100 years, but especially in the last 5.
Particularly
to
the
become
federal government, particularly.
The federal government,
Yeah.
and they have their own branches in the states and the cities too, the big cities. And this is the administrative state, and it is the fourth branch of government and the single most powerful. And we just cannot continue to function as a free and democratic society so long as this status quo.
And just for people that some Canadians may sitting back saying, well, gosh, this sounds really hard to understand and kind of beyond the pale. I mean, we have always had the challenge of the state becoming too large, too complicated, and too powerful beyond democratic control. And certainly we all recall the famous speech by President Dwight Eisenhower, former Allied Supreme Commander and all the rest, warning of the industrial defense complex in his famous public speech. And he was onto something. And so that's metastasized to be really a cancer in the United States. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, it's what Eisenhower condemned as the military-industrial complex has come home, and now it's running basically everything. It's running your social media accounts. It's controlling the search engines that you use. It's spying on your email. It's become very aggressive and all-pervasive.
It's
he was
stunning.
A real prophet.
So, Jeffrey, as we look at the big policy issues on the horizon, I want to just summarize them, and please help me here. Closing the open border with Mexico and the United States. Energy independence, as Biden has totally tried to turn off the American energy industry, which has made affordable energy possible. We've got issues like stopping the censorship and wokeism, especially including the universities. We've got stopping the spending and the endless corruption and politicization of so many issues. And we've got the cutting of the deep state. We've got, including the FBI, and dealing with, what is it called, China and Iran. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and there's a lot of American political forces right now that are anxious to externalize the threats. So it's always about Russia, Iran, China, Mexico, blah, blah, blah. But really, what people should be talking about is the enemy within. That's the main problem. I can promise you, as bad as the CCP is in Iran and Russia and Mexico, and their fentanyl or whatever, the big enemy for the American liberty right now is right here in the United States. And that's what we need to be talking about. And we're talking about that more and more, I'm glad to say.
Okay.
It's becoming more of a debate now.
So there is a sign of hope. And would you say then one of those practical signs of hopes is an extraordinary project called Project 2025? I know that the Heritage Foundation is all over this in terms of both providing a very concrete roadmap on policy, e.g. the actions that a new government would take, likely a Trump administration. But it's the list of people. It's not just looking at the action of policies. It's actually creating a list of 15 to 20,000 people that would come in and right-size this embedded, dare I say, cancer within the United States. Would you think that's part of the solution?
It is, but that itself is a real challenge, because you got to figure that if they don't succeed, these people will never work again. I mean, a lot of people who worked for the Trump administration from 2016 all the way to 2020 were not able to get their jobs back, even in Ivy League.
So you're saying that this is so this is how serious this is. These people are going full bore at anybody who opposes them by shutting them out of job opportunities, literally putting them in jail. Like, this is very serious time now.
Out of academia, out of the corporate world, out of everything. So the people who are going to work for Trump in the second Trump administration, it's the last job they're ever going to have. So they've got to do a good job. So that we really are at an existential sort of turning point right now. And I don't know if Trump's going to be able to attract. My mind goes two ways on this. One is he's not going to attract a lot of great talent. On the other hand, everybody who does good work for a second Trump administration will definitely be committed to winning.
Wow.
So that's another way to look at it.
Isn't that something? So 2024 is a very significant year, Jeffrey Tucker, and we're going to keep in touch as we continue to work through this. And I really appreciate your help to understand the landscape of the United States, its complexity and its significance. And we certainly wish you all the very best, and we thank you for all your leadership and work.
Well, thank you. We've got this is the challenge of our generation. We've got to get this right. And I believe there is hope that we can do it. We can recover freedom. We can rediscover our Constitution, and we can right this ship. We have to believe that. I think it is possible, but it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of determination, and a lot of moral courage.
Well said,
Thank
Jeffrey.
you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.